What if the timeline we have been taught about in school actually starts in the mid-1800s, with a new false historical narrative superimposed onto this infrastructure, one which brought cruelty, great suffering, degradation, and division to humanity? What if the original order of society was turned upside down, and we have been the subjects of a vast human and social engineering project, not for our best interest, but that of other beings? What if exhibitions, expositions, and world fairs, starting in 1851, were showcasing the technology and architectural wonders of the original civilization before being hidden away or forever destroyed? I have come to believe that 1851 was the year that the historical reset New World Order timeline was officially kicked off with the Crystal Palace exhibition in London. To support this belief, I will bring forth information from research about social conditions in charitable organizations, orphan trains, orphanages, infantoriums, and immigration to the United States starting in the mid-19th century. I will first focus on social conditions of that time period and go through background information with regards to the charitable organizations and related topics that all formed around the same time period in our historical narrative. The Association for Improving the Condition of the Poor, or AICP, was a charitable organization established in New York City in 1843 and incorporated in 1848. Robert Milham Hartley, a prominent mercantile businessman, was chosen as the AICP's first executive secretary. I can't find a portrait of him anywhere, so here is a photo of the cover of one of his books. Hartley was also one of the founders of the New York Temperance Society in 1829. The temperance movement was called a social movement against the consumption of alcohol, and typically criticized alcohol consumption and emphasized alcohol's negative effects on people's health, personalities, and lives, in many cases demanding the complete prohibition of it. This is really interesting to me because the alcoholic beverage industry was becoming established during the same time period, creating the juxtaposition of a culture on one hand that encouraged the profuse consumption of alcohol, and at the same time a counterforce within that same culture that not only criticized alcohol, but that also got involved in charitable institutions, with a stated mission of guiding the poor out of impoverishment supposedly caused by the character weakness of alcoholism in many cases. John Molson's brewery was established in 1786 in Montreal, Quebec, Canada. John Molson was said to have been orphaned at the age of 8 in England, when first his father died and then his mother 2 years later. He lived with various guardians until he left England for Montreal in 1782 at the age of 18. After his arrival in Montreal, he moved in with a brewer, Thomas Lloyd, and shortly thereafter became a partner of the brewery. At the age of 21, he took over the brewery completely. Soon Molson's beer was in high demand, which was said to have appealed to different classes of Montreal society, with customers increasing every day. Between 1788 and 1800, his business grew quickly into one of the larger ones in Lower Canada, having sold 30,000 gallons, or 113,500 liters, of beer by 1791. Molson was appointed by the Provincial Grand Master of the District Freemasonic Lodge of Montreal by the Duke of Sussex in 1826, a position he held for 5 years before resigning in 1831. In St. Louis, George Schneider founded the Bavarian Brewery in 1852, but financial problems forced him to sell the brewery to various owners during the late 1850s, one of which was Eberhard Anheuser, a prosperous German-American soap and candle maker. The name became E. Anheuser and Company in 1860. A wholesaler who had immigrated from Germany to St. Louis in 1857, Adolphus Busch, became Eberhard Anheuser's son-in-law in 1861. and the company became known as Anheuser-Busch in 1879. Adolphus Busch became president after Eberhard Anheuser's death in 1880. It is interesting to note the strange picture of the woman at the center of the illustration. In the advertisement, on a pedestal with a beer glass raised in one hand, and in the other holding a young child's hand, with the child being turned almost upside down in what looks to be a very uncomfortable position. The company that became known as Seagram's originated in 1857 as the Waterloo Distillery. With a similar story to John Molson, Joseph E. Seagram was orphaned at the age of 11 after his parents moved to Canada. He was raised there by clergy and attended a boarding school. He eventually attended business college in Buffalo, New York, and he was also a Freemason and member of the Grand River Lodge, number 151 in Ontario's County of Waterloo. Around 1864, Seagram became a manager at the Waterloo Distillery for the owner, George Randall, and by 1869, he bought Randall out, and the company became Seagram and Roos. By 1883, Joseph Seagram became the full owner after buying out Roos, and it eventually became a Canadian multinational conglomerate and was once the largest owner of alcoholic beverage lines in the world. Ferdinand Heim Sr. was said to have come to the United States from Austria in 1854, and he started brewery operations in Missouri and Illinois between 1857 and 1879. And then father and sons, Joseph, Ferdinand Jr., and Michael, jointly purchased the Star Ale Brewery of the East Bottoms in Kansas City in 1884. We are told the Heim brothers developed the first electric park in Kansas City, next to the brewery in East Bottoms, for which the Heim brothers were said to have built a streetcar line and wanted a way to attract visitors to the streetcar line and to the brewery. Opened from 1899 to 1906, the first electric park was an immediate success as one of the world's first full-time amusement parks. Among other things, beer was piped directly from the brewery to the beer garden in the park. So here you have Escape from Reality plus strong German lager. Was there something going on with regards to the intentional production and promotion of alcohol into our modern culture and the charitable aid organizations, especially where children are concerned? Please bear with me as I first take a closer look into Robert Milham Hartley, the first executive secretary of the Association for Improving the Condition of the Poor, also known as the AICP, as I think there is something of importance to the bigger picture going on here that is not easily found in the written historical narrative. Hartley played a key role in establishing the AICP, using the teachings of people like Thomas Chalmers, a Scottish minister who was born in 1780 and died in 1847, who has been called Scotland's greatest 19th century churchman. In 1832, Chalmers published a book called On Political Economy, in which he argued that the right economic condition of the masses is dependent on their right moral condition, and that comfort comes from character and not the reverse of character coming from comfort. This book has been selected by scholars as being culturally important and part of the knowledge base of civilization as we know it. So we have influential, harsh, and paternalistic attitudes towards humanity and human development being actively promoted during this time period. In November of 1817, Thomas Chalmers appealed for a Christian effort to deal with the social condition of Glasgow. He didn't think that parochial organizations had kept pace with the growing population of the city. The town council agreed to build one new church in 1817, attaching it to a parish of 10,000 persons, and this church was offered to Chalmers. In September of 1819, he became minister of the St. John Church and Parish, and this massive and beautiful building was demolished in 1962. Chalmers was the center of the parish system of 2,000 families, 2 private schoolhouses with 4 teachers, where 700 children attended at a moderate cost, and over 1,000 children who were taught in 40 to 50 local Sunday schools. Running the parish was said to give Chalmers ideas about how to deal with the problem of the relief of poverty. He believed that the cause of poverty was the poor having too many children, and that private charity should outweigh public expenditure in relieving poverty. One more thing about Glasgow. The development of places in Glasgow, like George Square, named after King George III, was said to have started in the 1820s, and we are told that by the 1880s, fine classical buildings, described as statements of power, wealth, and confidence, started appearing along fine new streets. Also in the same time period, in contrast with the proud classical buildings that were said to have started appearing in Glasgow, there was a population explosion, which led to a problem with urban squalor in Glasgow, and public health crises with epidemics of cholera, typhus, and typhoid. Where exactly were all of these poor people coming from? Was it from natural increase, migration, and boundary extensions as surrounding boroughs were annexed to Glasgow? Or was the cause of the population explosion from something else? Not only that, you have the same promotion of alcohol going on in Glasgow and the British Isles that was taking place during the same time period in North America. I found the establishment in Glasgow of Teacher's Scotch Whisky in 1830. William Teacher established his whiskey product in 1830, and by the 1850s began to open public houses known as dram shops in which customers could drink whiskey. The main attraction of the dram shops was their reputation for providing customers with high-quality whiskey. I have definitely come to believe that addictions were created and promoted intentionally to keep humanity stuck in a diminished level of consciousness and keep people from achieving their potential. An addiction is a compulsive, chronic, physiological, or psychological need for a habit-forming substance, behavior, or activity having harmful effects. Back in New York, one of Robert Milham Hartley's solutions to the problem of poverty was encouraging poor people to move to the country. Escape then from the city, he said, for escape is your only recourse against the terrible ills of beggary, and the further you go, the better. By the early 1850s, the AICP was the most influential charity in New York, and its program was soon imitated in many other American cities. The association stressed character building as a way to end poverty and took steps to ensure that only the deserving poor received charity. Idlers, malingerers, and vagrants were to be sent to workhouses to do hard labor, while the depraved and debased were to be locked up in penitentiaries as a warning to others not to follow their path. The AICP's program to aid New York's indigent children was similar in design to its program for adults. They were characterized by type, and each child was detailed to an appropriate venue, reformatories, school, and placement in good homes, depending on their moral character. The AICP was instrumental in putting truancy laws in place to effect this program, empowering the police and other agencies to arrest or detain vagrant children between the ages of 5 and 14 for evaluation and placement. So it sure looks like during the same period of time that addiction to alcohol was being intentionally created. The people themselves were being blamed for their poverty and poor living conditions, and minimal assistance was proposed to help them from charitable organizations that are supposed to be in existence to help them and guide them out of poverty. It is interesting to note that Robert Milham Hartley's son Marcellus was an American arms dealer and merchant who became the Union Army's arms agent to purchase guns from Europe during the American Civil War. In 1888, Marcellus bought and became chairman of Remington Arms and the Union Metallic Cartridge Company of Bridgeport, Connecticut. He also supplied arms during the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 and the Russo-Turkish Wars between 1877 and 1878. Marcellus Hartley's grandson and heir, Marcellus Hartley Dodge Sr., became the president of the Remington Arms Company and was a family member associated with the Phelps Dodge Corporation, a diversified import-export firm involved in mining, among other things, in operation between 1834 and 2007. Marcellus Hartley Dodge Sr. married Geraldine Rockefeller, the daughter of William Rockefeller Jr., a co-founder of Standard Oil, and she was estimated to have her own fortune of $100 million, and they were said to be the wealthiest newlyweds in the country upon their marriage. Their only child, Marcellus Hartley Dodge Jr., who was the heir to the Remington Rockefeller fortune, died at the age of 22 in an automobile crash in France in 1930. We have a Remington Arms Rockefeller connection to the AICP's first executive secretary. Wow. The following screenshots are from a page entitled The Origin of Compulsory Education on Foster Gamble's Thrive website. As I recall, it was from Foster Gamble's movie Thrive that I first learned that the Rockefellers were the originators of the American educational system. When John D. Rockefeller established the General Education Board, it says the interest was in organizing children and creating reliable, predictable, and obedient citizens, and not in producing critical thinkers. Massachusetts passed the first mandatory attendance law in 1852, which lines up with everything else that was happening in this new timeline. Even as early as 1914, the National Education Association expressed alarm at the activity of the Carnegie and Rockefeller Foundations and their efforts to control the policies of state educational institutions and everything related to the educational system. The AICP proposed the establishment of the New York Juvenile Asylum, now known as the Children's Village, and it was said to have been chartered in 1850 by 24 philanthropists who were concerned about the growing number of street children in New York City. Its mission was to care for, train, and morally uplift a mixed group of the city's poor children. It opened on January 10th of 1853, first in a rented building, and then property was purchased for a permanent location in Washington Heights in 1854. The 24 incorporators of the New York Juvenile Asylum included people like Robert B. Minturn, one of the most prominent American merchants and shippers of the mid-19th century. Robert was a partner in the shipping company of Grinnell, Minturn and Company, and the company bought the clipper ship the Flying Cloud for the San Francisco line, launched in 1851, and setting the record for the fastest passage between New York and San Francisco after, we are told, the shipping company established a line to serve the market in California that the 1849 gold rush caused. Minturn's business was said to have prospered from the transportation of many immigrants to the United States, including those from the Great Irish Famine of 1845 to 1849, a period of mass starvation and disease in Ireland. The cause of the famine was attributed to a natural event, a potato blight that affected not only Ireland, but in other European countries where the revolutions of 1848 were, in part, affected by people who were dependent on the potato as a food staple. This subject will be coming up again when I look at the subject of 19th century immigration. Robert Minturn Sr. was an active manager of many charitable associations in New York City, aided in establishing the Association for Improving the Condition of the Poor, and he was a founder of St. Luke's Hospital. And he and his wife were believed to be the donors of the land for the establishment of New York's Central Park. Another incorporator of the New York Juvenile Asylum was Mindert Van Schaik, a New York politician and philanthropist. I find it interesting to note that he was credited with being the driving force behind the planning, enacting of the pertinent legislation, and construction of the Croton Aqueduct. The old Croton Aqueduct, said to have been built between 1837 and 1842, originates in Croton in Westchester County and is 41 miles or 227 kilometers long. The now decommissioned reservoir in Central Park, called the Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis Reservoir, was said to have been built between 1852 and 1862 for the Croton Aqueduct. I seriously doubt the truthfulness of this information in the historical narrative, and about any massive engineering project said to have been built during this time period, for that matter. According to the history we have been taught, what technology did we have during that time that could build a massive engineering project like this? And the construction of the Central Park Reservoir would have ended during the American Civil War, which started in 1861. Mindert Van Schaik was interred in the New York Marble Cemetery after his death in 1865. The New York Marble Cemetery is an historic cemetery that was founded in 1830, and its approximately 2,100 burials were from the most prominent families in New York City, including the Upper Tens, or the Upper 10,000, a 19th century phrase referring to the wealthiest 10,000 residents of New York City. I wonder what makes this small space so special as a resting place. And the New York Marble Cemetery is even a popular event venue in Manhattan, with this photograph there taken at a Victorian-themed garden party a couple of years ago. At any rate, the New York Juvenile Asylum, or NYJA, sent an estimated 6,000 children out west between September of 1854 until 1923, and was in the top 4 of institutions participating in the American Orphan Train movement. The NYJA supplied 30 of the 46 children for the very first company of children sent to Dowagiac, Michigan, by Charles Loring Brace's New York Children's Aid Society in a new experimental program called Placing Out, and was a function of the Children's Aid Society's Immigration Department. After a long and arduous journey involving 2 train rides and 2 boat rides, the children arrived in Dowagiac, where 37 of the 46 children were said to have found adoptive homes in local families. The remaining unadopted children were said to have traveled by way of Chicago to an Iowa City orphanage to seek foster families for them. On the basis of this 80% placement rate in Dowagiac, the program was deemed a success and led to approximately 75 years of orphan trains taking something like 200,000 children across the continent to uncertain destinations and uncertain futures with strangers. Charles Loring Brace established the Children's Aid Society in 1853. It was during this time that the American West was opening up for settlement, and Brace's vision was to emigrate children to live with Western farming families. A movement going in this direction was widely supported by wealthy New York families, like Charlotte Augusta Gibbs, the wife of John Jacob Astor III, who was the wealthiest Astor family member of his generation. Thus far, 2 of the 13 bloodline family names have popped up in my research around charitable aid influencers and activities centering around the poor in 19th century America. I believe these families are the main orchestrators of what has taken place on Earth and to humanity on the historical reset New World Order timeline. Like what we saw during the same time period in Glasgow, starting around 1830, there was a population explosion of the poor, especially of homeless children in large eastern cities such as New York City. There was an estimated 10,000 to 30,000 homeless children in New York City by 1850, which was said to have a population at the time of 500,000 people. After a year of dispatching children individually to farms in nearby Connecticut, Pennsylvania, and rural New York, the Children's Aid Society undertook its first large-scale operation with that orphan train to Dowagiac, Michigan, in 1854 that started the whole orphan train placing out movement. Before they boarded the train, children were dressed in new clothing, given a Bible, and placed in the care of the Children's Aid Society agents who accompanied them west. As part of the orphan train movement, committees of prominent local citizens were organized in the towns where the train stopped. These committees were responsible for arranging a site for the adoptions, publicizing the event, and arranging lodging for the orphan train group. Though committees were required to consult with the Children's Aid Society on the suitability of local families interested in adopting children, Brace's system put its faith in the kindness of strangers. Many of the children did not understand what was happening. They were placed in homes for free and were expected to serve as an extra pair of hands to help with chores around the farm, with families expected to raise them as they would their natural-born children, providing them with decent food and clothing, a common education, and legal adoption was not a requirement. Many orphan-trained children went to live with families that placed orders specifying age, gender, hair, and eye color. Others were paraded from the depot into a local playhouse, where they were put up on stage. The Children's Aid Society sent an average of 3,000 children via train each year from 1855 to 1875 to 45 states, as well as Canada and Mexico. Criticisms of the orphan train movement focused on concerns that initial placements were made hastily, without proper investigation, and that there was insufficient follow-up on placements. Charities were also criticized for not keeping track of children placed while under their care. What was the true significance of the orphan train movement? Was it really about finding impoverished children from the city a good home and a better life, as we are taught? Was the orphan train movement a means to populate the country with parentless children with no history and no sense of connection to wherever and with whomever they landed? Or does the orphan train movement really represent the beginning of an organized, industrial-scale trafficking of children by the elite? And what about America's orphanages? We are told orphanages hardly existed until urbanization and immigration intensified in the 1830s, and 23 private orphan asylums opened up, and that by 1850, New York alone had 27 public and private orphanages. Some examples of such places were on New York City's Randall's Island. This 1849 illustrated print depicts the nursery establishment on Randall's Island. The Randall's Island Nursery was a public almshouse established in 1848 for young children without parents, for whatever reason, abandoned, orphaned, parents without means for care. The age range of the nursery establishment was said to typically be between 3 and 12 years of age, where they were kept separate from the adult almshouse, and older children were typically hired out as either indentured servants or apprentices. Then there was the House of Refuge, also located on Randall's Island, which had been established in 1825 and was the first juvenile reformatory in the United States. The Society for the Prevention of Pauperism, or SPP, had been founded in 1817 to study the causes of poverty and suggest new programs for preventive solutions. John Griscom, one of the SPP founders, was the chair of a committee formed to study the causes. He reported on what the factors were that the committee had determined were at the root of poverty. They were 1. Ignorance, 2. Idleness, 3. Intemperance in drinking, 4. Lack of savings by the poor, 5. Imprudent and hasty marriages, 6. Lotteries, 7. Pawnbrokers, 8. Prostitution, and 9. The charitable organizations of the city that promoted pauperism. The SPP disbanded in 1823 to focus on the creation of a solution to the problem of juvenile delinquency, and the belief that it could decrease pauperism by focusing on the moral judgment and work ethic of young people. The House of Refuge was born, an asylum for juveniles from all across New York who had been adjudicated as vagrants or found guilty of minor crimes, and it was a place to teach and train them, to steer them away from prison and keep them out of poverty. We are told the beautiful architecture of the House of Refuge was demolished in 1935, and the Downing Stadium in the lower right-hand corner was built, with a construction date given of 1935 to 1936, and that this stadium was demolished in 2002 to make room for the current Icon Stadium. Then came the American Civil War, the result of which was said to increase the number of orphans, with an estimated 400,000 children who lost parents. The Confederate Orphans' Home of Mississippi was opened in 1866 in Lauderdale Springs, Mississippi, in a former resort hotel prior to the war, and generally accepted children ranging in age from 6 to 16, with some exceptions for younger children depending on the circumstances. It closed its doors permanently in 1878. Then there was the Amelia Island Orphanage Asylum in the Ferdinanda Beach area on the coast between Jacksonville, Florida, and South Georgia. The Union forces reclaimed Fort Clinch on Amelia Island in 1862, the construction of which was said to have started in 1847, after the end of the Second Seminole War in 1842, as part of a system of coastal defenses. It definitely appears to be a star fort, which are found all over the earth with similar design patterns and heavy masonry, which I believe were circuitry on the Earth's grid system and built by the original civilization. At any rate, the upheaval of the Civil War was said to have caused a growing crisis on Amelia Island, with a high number of displaced and orphaned children struggling to find food and shelter, and the orphan asylum was established by educator and abolitionist Chloe Merrick, who had come from Syracuse, New York, and traveled to the Sea Islands to help teach children through the Freedmen's Bureau. The orphanage was set up in a home between 1863 and 1866 that was said to have been built in the 1850s by Irish immigrant and local businessman Joseph Finnegan, who had joined the Confederate Army when Florida seceded from the Union in 1861. Chloe Merrick bought Finnegan's home for $25 when the creation of the Florida Direct Tax Commission in 1863 allowed for the seizure of his property, established the orphanage, and then she lost the home back to him when the Freedmen's Bureau ordered Merrick to return Finnegan's property to him in the summer of 1866, which was home to approximately 70 children at the time. Her program continued on for another year at a location in Jacksonville before it closed for good, and the orphans living there went to other institutions or were placed in apprenticeships in Florida. In addition to this example, from what I read, there was a great deal of social chaos going on during this time period on Amelia Island, placing both adults and children at risk for harm by others, and I am certain in many other places as well. I first encountered the Knights of Pythias at the Pythian Castle of Springfield, Missouri, when I was tracking a circle alignment that begins and ends in Algiers, Algeria. What jumped out at me on learning about the Knights of Pythias is that it was a secret society founded in Washington, D.C. in February of 1864. It was the first fraternal order to receive a charter by an act of Congress. It is interesting to note that the Civil War didn't end until 1865. For what purpose would Congress charter a fraternal secret society in wartime? I will just leave this National Fire Protection Association hazard diamond signage here for comparison on the left, as I thought of it when I saw the Knights of Pythias logo on the right. Coincidence? Or is there some kind of connection? I don't discount any possibility with the amount of secret society symbolism that goes on without our awareness. I will start at the Pythian home of Missouri, where I first heard of this congressionally chartered secret society when I first encountered the Knights of Pythias in Springfield, Missouri, and then give other examples of Pythian orphanages. We are told that this Pythian home was constructed by the order in 1913 as a home for needy members of their order and their widows and orphans. The original main floor features things like a grand foyer, ballroom, and sitting parlors. In addition to this home, the Knights of Pythias built orphanages in places like Clayton, North Carolina, near Raleigh. The construction of this orphanage was said to have started in 1910, and it is reported as no longer standing. The Pythian home in Weatherford, Texas, opened in 1909 for widows and orphans of Knights of Pythias members. It is in operation as a children's home to this day. The Pythian home in Springfield, Ohio, was said to be the first constructed by the order in 1894. No longer standing, it was located north of Springfield's Wittenberg University. I know I could go on with more examples of orphanages from what we are told was the Civil War and post-Civil War era, and I have many more questions and answers about what was really going on here. I am sure that what we are told about the benevolent claims of somehow assisting orphans to elevate them out of poverty and provide a better life for them was different from what was really happening on many levels, covering up the truth not only about what was really going on here, but the truth about our history as well. Before I move on to the subject of infantoriums, I'm going to cross the pond to take a look at some examples from literature in Great Britain and France to look for the same human and social conditions there that existed in the United States during the same time period through the lens of two literary greats and their classics. Charles Dickens was born in February of 1812 and died in June of 1870 at the relatively young age of 58. He created some of the world's best-known fictional characters and is regarded by many as the greatest novelist of the Victorian era. In spite of having no formal education after having left school to work in a factory because his father was in debtor's prison, he edited a weekly journal for 20 years, wrote 15 novels, 5 novellas, and hundreds of short stories and articles. Amongst his earliest efforts, Sketches by Boz, illustrative of everyday life and everyday people, became a collection of short pieces Dickens published between 1833 and 1836 in different newspapers and periodicals. The first completed volume came along in 1839. George Cruikshank was involved with the illustrations. The work is divided into 4 sections: Our Parish, Scenes, Characters, and Tales. So, Charles Dickens' first published work involved illustrations of visual imagery forming our perceptions of what life was like at that time. This concept was further evolved when he agreed to a commission in 1836 to supply the description necessary for the Cockney sporting plates of illustrator Robert Seymour for a graphic novel, a book made up of comics content for serial publication. This was how the Pickwick Papers came about, first published in serial form, and called his first literary success. And who exactly was the target audience for the highly visual and cartoon-like nature of this early work? Like maybe a younger audience, perhaps? He sure wrote a lot of books featuring orphans, like Oliver Twist, first published in installments between 1837 and 1839, about a boy who was born and raised in the punitive and abusive workhouse system, which was established with the British Parliament's Poor Law Act of 1834, where there was no cash or material support given, and the only option for those who lived there was hard work and forced labor inside the workhouse in exchange for meager sustenance. Homes were broken up, belongings sold, and families separated. Victor Hugo, considered to be one of the greatest and best-known French writers, was born in 1802 and died in 1885. Les Miserables is one of his most famous works and considered one of the greatest novels of the 19th century, first published in 1862. Translations into English of Les Miserables include The Miserable Ones, The Wretched, The Poor Ones, The Wretched Poor, The Victims, and The Dispossessed. I won't go through the whole novel, which, unabridged, was one of the longest ever written, but I do want to bring forward relevant information to my findings about it. The book contains a number of subplots, but the main plot of the story is about ex-convict Jean Valjean, who was arrested as a boy for 5 years for stealing a loaf of bread for his starving sister and her family, then gets 14 more years as punishment for numerous escape attempts. After release from prison, he makes some poor choices, but because of kindness shown to him as a result of one of them, he becomes a force for good. But he is tracked relentlessly throughout the novel by a police inspector who knew him in prison and who wants to penalize him for mistakes he made before he changed his life for the better. Other characters in the novel include Cosette, a young girl whom Jean Valjean rescued from servitude to a family who were mean and abusive to her. As the various subplots interweave, the backdrop of the story becomes the Paris uprising of 1832. Les Miserables gave the relatively unknown 1832 rebellion widespread renown. We are told the rebellion originated as an anti-monarchist insurrection on June 5th and June 6th of 1832, in an attempt by Parisian Republicans to reverse the establishment in 1830 of the July monarchy of Louis Philippe of the House of Bourbon, who was the last king of France. The economic and social conditions leading up to the 1832 Paris uprising were as follows: harvest failures, food shortages, increases in the cost of living, and a cholera outbreak which devastated the poor neighborhoods of Paris. The 1832 Paris uprising started on June 5th, the day of the funeral of Jean-Maximilien Lamarck, a French commander during the Napoleonic War, who later became a member of the French Parliament. Lamarck opposed the restoration of the House of Bourbon and the Ancien regime of France. Ancien? Ancient? There are many references in our historical narrative to ancient that go back only centuries as opposed to millennia, which better fits the definition of ancient as pertaining to the far distant past. An example of this is St. Augustine, Florida, which has a nickname of the ancient city, which is interesting because the year of its establishment was said to be 1565, which is not a year considered to be ancient history studies. The course of the 1832 Paris uprising was that after Lamarck's funeral, the Republican conspirators provoked riots with an army they had organized of Parisian workers and local youth and refugees from Poland, Germany, and Italy, and they took control of the eastern and central districts of Paris for a short period of time. They made the Porte Saint-Martin their stronghold, a 60-foot or 18-meter high triumphal arch made of limestone and marble, said to have been built in 1674. They built barricades around the narrow streets in the surrounding area. In the novel Les Miserables, the character of Gavroche was a young street urchin who takes part in the barricades and was killed while collecting bullets from dead National Guardsmen. I believe the literature of Charles Dickens and Victor Hugo were being used both as programming devices with which to shape our collective minds with the new historical narrative, and at the same time telling us what was going on with regards to replacing the old world order with the new world order, and documenting, among other things, the conditions of poverty and the negative societal impacts on children that was rampant across continents during the 19th century. Now onto the bizarre subject of infantoriums. We are told that infant incubators containing premature babies were displayed in shows called infantoriums. The French physician Dr. Alexander Lyon modernized the incubator technology available at the end of the 19th century with airtight metal-framed incubators and a constant temperature kept by heated air being pumped into it. And the first infant incubator exhibit was put forward by a man from Poland named Martin Kuhne, who claimed to be a medical doctor, starting at the Berlin Exposition in 1896. With the success of the infantorium in Berlin, Kuhne was invited to have his infant incubator show at Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee in London in 1897. Infant incubators were touted as neonatal health care, helping newborn babies with compromised immune systems by providing a sanitary environment to reduce the possibility of getting an infection. Kuhne perfected his sideshow at the 1901 World's Fair in Buffalo, New York. Dr. Kuhne set up amidst the sideshows and carnival rides of the Midway, and for which thousands of people paid 10 cents each to see Dr. Kuhne's incubator show. And parents from across the city brought their premature babies to Kuhne, hoping for a miracle, with a local medical journal reporting that 48 of the 52 babies delivered to Kuhne that summer had survived. Thus, in a short period of time at the turn of the century, infant incubators for premature babies became widely available at fairs and amusement parks across America, rather than hospitals, which we are told had nothing to help them. So what we are told is that many parents of premature, at-risk babies pretty much had to bring their infants to an infantorium at an amusement park or fair, and that these infant shows were the main source of health care for premature babies for over 40 years. Say what? Here's a photo of the infant incubators building on the trail at the 1905 Lewis and Clark Exposition in Portland, Oregon. We are told that Kuhne's infantorium at the Buffalo World's Fair in 1901 had gotten the attention of two businessmen who were planning to build a new park in Coney Island called Luna Park, and Martin Kuhne's futuristic infantorium became the center of the rides and attractions. In 1911, a different Coney Island park with one of Kuhne's shows went up in flames, and the staff of doctors and nurses were able to save all the babies, but the incident only solidified the fear that these parks were too hazardous. We are told that by the 1930s, most hospitals still hadn't created alternatives to Kuhne's infantoriums, so people kept bringing their newborns to the Midway. Then, in the depths of the Great Depression, incubators finally made a breakthrough when Martin Kuhne teamed up with a sympathetic medical practitioner in Chicago named Dr. Julius Hess. When Chicago hosted the World's Fair in 1933, Kuhne's exhibit had the explicit support of Dr. Hess. After the fair, Chicago became the first city in America to create a public health policy specifically for premature infants. Dr. Hess became known as the father of American neonatology. With the blessing of the Chicago medical community, other cities started putting incubators in their hospitals too. And as the doctors got on board, there wasn't much need for Kuhne's sideshow. Kuhne was said to have sunk all of his savings into keeping the incubator shows operating in New York. Then in 1943, a New York hospital was said to have opened the city's first department for premature babies, and Martin Kuhne decided it was finally time to get out of the infant incubator show business, and he closed up the infantorium at Luna Park later that same year. By 1944, Coney Island's Luna Park had burned down, and we are told that around this time, amusement parks all over the country were going up in flames. What was the real deal with these infantoriums? Besides the exploitation for profit of putting babies on display in a sideshow environment and charging admission to see them, the question remains, what happened to these premature babies? Did they all get to go home to their families after being put on display to the public? Why would premature babies in incubators even be a draw to people to see in a sideshow? Now I'm going to move on to the subject of mass immigrations from Europe and Asia, starting around the mid-19th century, and look specifically at Ireland, Germany, and China. I mentioned previously that the shipping business of Robert Minturn, one of the 24 incorporators of the New York Juvenile Asylum, was said to have prospered from the transportation of many immigrants to the United States. From 1820 to 1870, we are told that over 7.5 million immigrants came to the United States. The main cause for the mass departure of the Irish for America is typically cited as the Great Potato Famine of 1845 to 1849, also known as the Great Hunger or the Great Starvation. During much of the 18th century in Ireland, landowners, many of whom lived in England, hired middlemen to collect the rents of tenants, who were paid minimal income to raise crops and livestock for export. With the potato crop failure, families were evicted from whatever they called home by these middlemen because of their inability to pay rent. The Irish immigrants that came to America found work for low wages in labor gangs building all manner of infrastructure, as menial labor of all kinds, in mines, in textile mills and factories, and some went west to California and San Francisco. We are told that by 1860, some 4,000 miles or 6,400 kilometers of canals across America had been dug by the labor of Irish immigrants, and that they also went to work on the railroad. I think it is far likelier that all of this immigrant labor was being used to dig out the canal and rail infrastructure where there was mud and making it serviceable than they were actually building it. This is the Paw Paw Tunnel, the largest man-made structure on the C&O Canal in Allegheny County, Maryland, near Paw Paw, West Virginia. Dubbed one of the wonders of the world in the 19th century, construction of it using immigrant labor was said to have started in 1836, with the tunnel being hand-dug and black powder blasted, and that more than 6 million bricks were used in the building of it. We were told that after all of that work, and after nearly bankrupting the C&O Canal Company, that by the time it opened in 1850, it was already rendered obsolete by the railroad, although mule-pulled canal boats transported goods through it until 1924. I found this book entitled The Filth of Progress, Immigrants, Americans, and the Building of Canals and Railroads in the West when I was looking for images about this subject. The book explores the suffering and survival of the workers who were treated as outsiders, while at the same time the capitalists who financed the projects were being lionized. In the decade from 1845 to 1855, more than 1 million Germans fled to the United States to escape economic hardship. Unlike the Irish, many of the German immigrants had enough money to journey to the Midwest in search of farmland and work. The Germans sought to escape the political unrest caused by riots, rebellion, and the revolutions of 1848. The revolutions of 1848 were a series of political upheavals throughout Europe that year. The revolutions had the aim of removing the old monarchical structures and creating independent nation-states, and was the most widespread revolutionary wave in Europe's history, with 50 countries being affected. The most important of these revolutions were in France, the Netherlands, Italy, the Austrian Empire, and the states of the German Confederation that would make up the German Empire in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. For example, the 1848 revolution in France, called the February Revolution, ended the reign of King Louis Philippe, whose rule was first targeted in the Paris uprising of 1832 that I mentioned taking place in Les Miserables. Then there was the Daoguang Depression in China between 1820 and 1850, a prolonged economic decline that coincided with the two most traumatic events of the 19th century in China, the First Opium War and the Taiping Rebellion. The First Opium War was fought between the Qing dynasty of China and Britain between 1839 and 1842, a military engagement that started when the Chinese seized opium stocks at Canton in order to stop the opium trade, which was banned. The British government insisted upon free trade and equality among nations and backed the merchants' demands. From 1757 to 1842, the Canton system served as a means for China to control trade with the West by focusing all trade in the southern port of Canton. To counter this, the British East India Company began to grow opium in Bengal, in present-day Bangladesh, and allowed private British merchants to sell opium to Chinese smugglers for illegal sale in China. As a result from these events in history, opium dens, establishments where opium was sold and smoked, became prevalent in many parts of the world throughout the 19th century. Sounds like these events in China were part of the same game plan that the widespread availability of alcoholic beverages played a part in during the same time period in history. They were a means by which to keep humanity asleep and unconscious as much as possible and make a ton of money on our addictions in the process. The Taiping Rebellion took place in China between 1850 and 1864. It was a civil war between the established Qing dynasty, the last imperial dynasty of China, and the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, an unrecognized oppositional state in China supporting the overthrow of the Qing dynasty. Though we are told the Qing dynasty ultimately defeated the opposing forces with the eventual help of British and French forces, the Taiping Rebellion left the economic heartland of China in the lower and central Yangtze River basins in ruins, and millions of people lost their lives as a result of it. As well as that in Western eyes, China was marked as poor and backwards. The last emperor of China was Puyi, who became emperor at the age of 2 in 1908, and the Qing dynasty of which he was a part was overthrown 3 years later in the 1911 revolution, which established the Republic of China. Chinese immigration to the United States around the same time as the Irish and German immigration began en masse in the 1840s. But unlike immigrants coming from other countries, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 prohibited further immigration of all Chinese laborers for a period of 10 years, the only law to have been implemented to prevent all members of a specific ethnic or national group from immigrating to the United States. Like the Irish immigrants, the Chinese immigrants supplied labor for America's growing industry in the form of workers for factories, textile mills, and the railroad. And for the California gold rush starting in 1849. I have a lot of questions regarding what was going on with the famous 49er gold rush for many reasons, including this photo of San Francisco. This was said to be an early daguerreotype, an early form of photography of Portsmouth Square in San Francisco from 1851. It sure looks like a mud flood scene to me with all that dirt covering everywhere. Here are some other noteworthy photographs that I found in my research. The first was notated as Kansas City pre-1800s. And the second was notated as Pittsburgh in the early 1900s. How and why did all of these countries destabilize socially and economically all at the same time in the mid-1800s? This destabilization brought a flood of immigrants, most of whom had nothing, many of whom found work in low-wage, menial work, we are told, building the infrastructure of America and the New World. What was really going on here? Before taking a look into Ellis Island, I just want to mention that the problems of the destabilization of countries and mass immigration of people from these countries who have nothing is happening in the present day, in real time. Could this destabilization and human chaos have been intentionally created to usher in the New World Order? I most definitely think it was. Like the destruction of the ancient civilization, This is another human and social engineering process that has nothing to do with benefiting humanity. The Hegelian dialectic, problem, reaction, solution, the destabilization of Western civilization by uncontrolled mass immigration and radical Islam was going to be restored to order by the New World Order, was what they had planned. By the way, the DHR factor listed in the methods of manipulation is undetectable mind control. I didn't know that, so I looked it up. I am personally optimistic that things will not go as they planned because of things like the great awakening of humanity that is taking place right now, which is what they fear the most, because they have to have our consent for what they have done, and the only way they can get it is to lie to us. I would be remiss if I didn't visit the subject of Ellis Island under the topic of immigration. Ellis Island was first opened to new immigrants on January 1st of 1892. From 1892 to 1924, approximately 12 million immigrants arriving at the Port of New York and New Jersey were processed there under federal law. Ellis Island is located in Upper New York Bay, east of Liberty State Park in Jersey City, New Jersey, and north of Liberty Island and the Statue of Liberty. The island has a land area of 27.5 acres, or 11.1 hectares, much of which is from land reclamation. The fill for the land reclamation was acquired from the ballast of ships, as well as material excavated from the first line of the New York subway, which was said to have been constructed starting in 1900 and opened in 1904. And from rail yards like those of the Central Railroad of New Jersey. This was the main railroad terminal in Jersey City, New Jersey, that was said to have opened in 1889, and it is reported that an estimated 10.5 million immigrants processed through here to get to Ellis Island. So again I ask, did the fill for the land reclamation around Ellis Island in Upper New York Bay come from building the infrastructure or digging it out to make it serviceable for use? We are told the fill was retained with a system of wood piles and cribbing, and later encased with more than 7,700 linear feet of concrete and granite seawall. It was placed atop either wood piles, cribbing, or submerged bags of concrete. Across New York Harbor from Ellis Island, Castle Clinton in Battery Park had been used as an immigration station since 1855, processing more than 8 million immigrants until its closure in 1890, purportedly due to numerous scandals and unnecessary deaths. The federal government assumed control of immigration in early 1890 and commissioned a study to determine the best place for the new immigration station in New York Harbor, and the chosen location was Ellis Island. We are told that the first immigration station on Ellis Island, which was said to have processed an estimated 1.5 million immigrants, was comprised of wooden buildings in operation between 1892 until it was destroyed by a fire of unknown origin in 1897, destroying all immigration records from 1855. Co-architects William Alciphron Boring and Edward Lippincott Tilton are given the credit for what is described as French Renaissance architecture of the second immigration station seen here, and built between 1898 and 1900. The second immigration station closed in 1924 after immigrants became subject to national quotas, and their numbers dropped sharply. The legislation changed Ellis Island from a processing center to a detention and deportation facility for illegal immigrants. Ellis Island was shut down by the government in 1954. It currently houses the Museum for Ellis Island. It is here that I will look into the subject of Italian immigrants, since most didn't start coming to America until 1880. By 1870, there were about 25,000 Italian immigrants, many of them Northern Italian refugees from the wars accompanying the Risorgimento, the unification of the Italian states under King Victor Emmanuel II, which ended with the annexation of Venice in 1866 and the annexation of Rome on September 20th of 1870. The origins of the Risorgimento were the revolutions of 1848 mentioned previously. Between 1880 and 1924, there were more than 4 million Italian immigrants to America, half of them between 1900 and 1910, fleeing grinding rural poverty in southern Italy and Sicily, and most of this generation of immigrants coming through Ellis Island. The vast majority were farmers and laborers looking for a steady source of work, any work. Sounding familiar? Many found employment in low-wage manual labor jobs, and if they couldn't find jobs on their own, they turned to the padrone system, whereby Italian middlemen called padrone found jobs for groups of men and controlled their wages, transportation, and living conditions for a fee. Many sought housing in the older sections of northeastern cities, becoming known as Little Italies. By 1920, the Little Italies had stabilized and grown considerably more prosperous as workers were able to obtain higher-paying jobs. The tenements they lived in were frequently overcrowded with poor light, heating, and ventilation. World War I, along with the Restrictive Emergency Quota Act of 1921, the Immigration Act of 1924, and the implementation of the discriminatory national origins formula, heavily curtailed Italian immigration. The quota allocated for Italians was 1/13 of that allocated for Germans, and in general, Anglo-Saxon and Northern European immigration was heavily favored. Despite implementation of the quota, the inflow of Italian immigrants remained between 6 or 7% of all immigrants. So questions that I typically get asked include how to explain family ancestries that go back generations well before this time period, and also about why we haven't heard about this from the oral history passed down in families from elders that surely would have known about all of this. The best way for me to address this question is to briefly share an example from my own life. My mom's father's paternal family line is the best known and documented to me. Mom is an avid genealogist and has compiled a lot of information over the years. My great-great-great-grandfather Jesse came to Pasco County in Florida to homestead there in 1838. He had heard that there were cattle in Florida free to any man that could corral and tame them. Then, as the existing documentation for the story goes, he found out there were 5 wild Indians for every cow in the woods. He had military service during the Seminole Wars. My great-great-grandfather, King Joseph, Jesse's son, was born in 1850. My great-grandfather, David Edwin, King Joseph's son, was born in 1874. He was the district sales manager for the Virginia Carolina Chemical Corporation. He had also entered the citrus business as a young man and raised a large acreage of groves, known as some of the finest in the county. David Edwin left the groves to his sons, one of which was my grandfather Joe, who was a citrus grower until his death from cancer at the age of 42 in 1959. In summary, what's in the family narrative, which was written down by my relatives back in the day, was that the land in Florida was empty, available for homesteading, and was inhabited by cattle and wild Indians. So this is the Pasco County Courthouse in Dade City, the county seat of Pasco County, where this part of my family has lived for 5 generations. It was said to have been built and opened in 1909, and that it was designed in the classical revival style by the architect Edward Columbus Hosford, who is based out of Georgia. We are told not much is known about his early life and education, and this was the best I could do when I went to look for a picture of him. Dade City is in central Florida, not too far from Tampa. This is the University of Tampa, said to have been built as the Tampa Hotel by railroad magnate Henry Plant in 1891. I am seeing and saying this architecture was not built by the people that are given credit in sketchy stories for it, but by the people who originally lived here. This would be the Seminoles, one of the 5 civilized tribes of the southeastern part of what became the United States, along with the Choctaw, Cherokee, Chickasaw, and Muskogee nations, the majority of which were forcibly relocated from their ancestral lands. So much has been kept from us about the true identity of these people that it is virtually impossible to find the truth in the written and pictorial record. Truth can be found in architecture that doesn't match what we are told about who built it. I have extensively researched evidence for an ancient and advanced worldwide Moorish civilization with roots in ancient Mu, also known as Lemuria, that existed up until relatively recently. All of my research is based on my original finding of the sacred geometric shape of a star tetrahedron in 2016, when I found major cities lining up in lines in North America. I believe this is the terminus or key of the Earth's grid system. Once I found the star tetrahedron, I extended the lines out. I used a magnifying glass and wrote down the cities that lined up in linear and circular fashion, and then tracked and researched the places in alignment with each other. Here's a summary of the main findings of my research presented here. Starting in the 1830s, with the population explosion of poor people and parentless children, prominent people in both Europe and America organized charitable aid movements with a stated mission of helping people find their way out of impoverishment, providing guidance, advice, and at the same time providing the bare minimum of charitable aid. The prevailing social attitudes of the mid-19th century blamed people for their poverty and applied the notions of worthy and unworthy poor to charitable aid. During the same exact time period, starting in the 1830s, alcoholic beverages became widely available and were promoted for consumption to the general public. People warehouses became commonplace. Adult asylums, juvenile asylums, poorhouses, workhouses, almshouses, and so forth. Social attitudes about the poor and institutions for them were the same in America and Europe during the same time period. Elite family names showed up in connection with these charitable aid organizations, like the Rockefellers in connection with the first secretary of the Association for the Improvement of the Condition of the Poor, and the Astor family with Charles Loring Brace's Children's Aid Society and the Orphan Train Movement. The Orphan Train Movement started in 1854 with children's charitable aid providers and ended in 1923. Children were sent out with strangers to live with strangers, with no effective accountability for their well-being. Safeguards were in place for lip service, but the reality was that there was very little accountability for safe placement of the children during the orphan train movement. If a child ended up in a good home, it was more a matter of good luck than planning. The first juvenile reformatory was established in 1825 after a formal study of the causes of pauperism, with the stated goal of keeping youthful offenders out of prison and poverty. Public and private orphanages started to become commonplace by 1850. The American Civil War was said to have resulted in more orphanages, with an estimated 400,000 children needing placement. We are told there was a massive wave of immigration of approximately 7.5 million people to America starting in the 1840s from Ireland, Germany, and China, with crop failures, economic hardship, revolution, and wars to blame. The German immigrants had some financial means to travel and find decent occupations. The Irish and Chinese immigrants typically arrived with nothing and ended up taking jobs involving menial and manual labor, doing whatever they could find for low wages. Many of these jobs involved something to do with infrastructure. Then starting around 1870, there was a massive wave of Italian immigrants from northern Italy fleeing problems from the Risorgimento, or unification of Italy. And then the Italian immigrants started coming over in droves from southern Italy and Sicily in 1880, most to escape grinding rural poverty. The poor Italian immigrants likewise arrived with nothing and took whatever jobs they could find, like the Chinese and Irish immigrants before them. I shared examples of pictures I found dating from the 19th century and early 20th century of major cities with dirt and mud-caked infrastructure. Infantoriums displaying premature newborns in incubators became popular as sideshow attractions between 1896 and 1942. Why? Furthermore, here are some other possible direct connections between the events of the 19th century and the present day, in addition to the human chaos associated with the destabilization of countries and the mass immigration we see today that I already mentioned. Charles Loring Brace, founder of the Children's Aid Society and the Orphan Train movement, is considered the father of foster care. Is there a connection between the serious problem today of child trafficking originating from foster care, which is much less obvious and hidden from the general public, and the orphan trains? And what about the orphanages? Were they designed to be benevolent institutions providing care for parentless children, or something else entirely? I'm not saying that all places and people today providing care for these children fall into this category, but I am saying that these are avenues that have been used historically and in the present day for those looking to have access to children for nefarious purposes. Was there a connection between Planned Parenthood, the name by which Margaret Sanger's 1921 American Birth Control League became known in 1942, and the infantoriums of the late 19th century, around the same time Martin Cooney got out of the infant incubator show business in 1943? Is the opiate crisis of today related to the widespread availability of opium and the human devastation from opium that occurred after the Opium Wars in China in the mid-1800s? As a result of my research, I have come to believe that there was a relatively recent, deliberately caused worldwide liquefaction event, or mud flood, and that a new historical reset history and narrative was superimposed over the original history and existing infrastructure by negative beings who wanted to benefit themselves and have ultimate power and control over humanity. These negative beings have deliberately manipulated the events and conditions in our world for their benefit and our detriment. And we are asleep no more.